Today, I'm going to share 3 true stories where the facts in these stories are so bizarre, people today are still trying to explain them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 8 p.m. on April 25th, 1977, a 31-year-old man named Apolinario Souza Correa poured water on the campfire that he had built with his 3 brothers, Firmino, Aleriano, and Jose, on the beach of a small uninhabited island in northeast Brazil. The island was called Crab Island, and Apolinario and his family would take their boat there all the time because they would harvest lumber that they would then sell to local construction workers. Now, when they would go out to Crab Island, pretty much every single time, there was nobody else on this island. It was all theirs. But there was a specific reason for that. It was because most of their neighbors thought that Crab Island was haunted. People who visited the island would often report hearing these strange voices coming from the forest, in particular at night, even though nobody lived on this island. And then sometimes people even saw lights flashing over the treetops. But Apolinario and his brothers made really good money by going out to Crab Island, and also they just were not afraid of the stories people told. They thought they were all made up. And so today, they had arrived at Crab Island during high tide, which had been at about 12 p.m., and then they had spent the entire afternoon chopping down trees. But that didn't concern them, because they really hadn't planned to immediately sail back home. They had planned to actually have dinner on the island after they were done working, and then maybe sleep for a few hours actually on their boat while it was out on the mud. And then while they were sleeping for a few hours, the tide would come back in again. It would raise their boat up. They would wake up, and they'd be ready to sail home at that point. And so that's what they did. They had this long day of work. They had their dinner by the campfire. And then after Apolinario put out the fire, he and his brothers waded into the mud over towards their boat, which was literally sitting, low tide on the mud. And they climbed on board. They walked into the main cabin. They laid down their sleeping pads. And it didn't take long for them all to fall asleep. Now, Apolinario and his brothers had only intended to sleep until about midnight. But when Apolinario woke back up again, although it was still dark in the cabin, he looked out the tiny window and he saw that the sky outside was already pink from the sunrise. And when he saw this, he groaned because he knew they had overslept and had missed high tide. Basically, their boat had gone back up and then back down into the mud, and now they were stuck again and would have to wait likely until noon to finally be able to leave. So it was just a nuisance. And so at this point, Apolinario looked over to see if his 3 brothers were still asleep. And he saw that Firmino and Jose were still asleep on their sleeping pads with their blankets pulled up over their faces. But his 3rd brother, Aleriano, his sleeping pad was empty and he wasn't inside the cabin. And so as Apolinario is realizing, his 3rd brother is gone, doesn't know where he is, he hears this just deafening screaming coming from outside on the boat, but not inside the main cabin. And so immediately Apolinario, he jumps up, he runs outside, and he finds his 3rd brother, Aleriano. And his brother was completely covered in burns. Apolinario was so horrified that he just froze because it looked like his brother's skin had literally been set on fire. And then he noticed something even stranger about the whole thing, which was, his brother, despite being so badly burned, his clothes didn't appear burned. It was like literally just his skin. Like somehow his skin had caught fire, but nothing else on him. And his brother is just screaming in agony, and Apolinario has no idea what to do. He has no idea how this even happened. And while this is happening, this sort of shocked moment, Apolinario begins to hear moaning coming from back inside the cabin where he came from. And so just sort of acting on instinct, he ran back inside the cabin, and remember his 2 brothers, Firmino and Jose, their blankets were up over their heads, so he hadn't seen them yet. And so he runs in, he knows the moaning is coming from one of them, and he pulls back the blankets, and he sees the moaning is coming from Firmino, and his skin is just horribly burned, like his skin is literally falling off his body, but just like his other brother, his clothes didn't appear to be burned at all. It was like just his skin had been set on fire, and he's moaning in just pure agony. And then Apolinario, he looks over at his other brother, who's also on his sleeping pad, Jose, and he was not burned, but he was dead. Now, unfortunately, because of the tides, Apollinario still had to wait a full 6 hours before he could get his brothers off the island. And so they waited until the tide came in, and then finally they took off. And then when they got back to land, Oleriano, who was the one who was screaming outside the main cabin, who had, burns all over his body, he was badly hurt, but not maybe critically so. He stayed behind with Jose's body, and Apollinario wound up taking Firmino to the hospital because his injuries looked like they could be critical. When they finally got to the hospital, Firmino was barely conscious, his injuries were really taking a toll on him. It was like his body was shutting down. But as soon as he was checked in, the doctors asked him, hey, just tell us how you got these burns. Give us some indication of how this happened. And right before Firmino slipped into a coma from his burns, he was able to tell them that when he and his brothers were still out at Crab Island, he had looked out the window from inside the cabin of his boat when they were all sleeping in the boat, and outside there was this inexplicable ball of fire hovering in the air. And that's all he remembered. He had no idea how he actually got burned. So the police opened an investigation into whatever happened that night at Crab Island. And they would come up with several theories that, maybe could explain it, including that maybe the men had simply injured each other and were just sort of lying about it. Maybe they had taken drugs or were under the influence of something, and while being that way, they could have hurt themselves or each other, or just something could have happened that they didn't remember. Or another theory was maybe lightning struck the beach and somehow reflected off the sand, and bolts of lightning made their way out into the boat and, burned two and killed one. But the reality is these theories, there was no evidence to support any of them. In fact, the big takeaway from this investigation is basically that when they went out to that island, they found nothing. There was just no evidence whatsoever. Ultimately, the two injured surviving brothers, Firmino and Oleriano, they would make full recoveries, but neither of them ever could remember any meaningful details of what happened. And so eventually the case was closed without really any answers. But strange stories continued to come from Crab Island. People continued to hear voices and see strange lights. And then finally, in April of 1986, so 9 years after the death of Jose, a different crew of 4 men traveled out to Crab Island to harvest timber. And at some point, they all recalled hearing this loud crashing sound out in the woods. And then they all just fell unconscious. And when they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. One of them was dead, and another one was inexplicably covered in burns. And just like the brothers 9 years earlier, the survivors of this incident had no memory of what happened. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the night of June 12, 1993, 69-year-old Deke Slayton climbed into bed in his home in League City, Texas. And even this small action, getting in bed, took a lot of effort for Deke because he was very, very sick. So Deke had a brain tumor. He'd actually been diagnosed the year before, but had then quickly gone into remission, so he thought he'd beaten it. But it had unfortunately come back a few months later, and this time it was much worse. Deke knew eventually this thing was going to kill him, and unfortunately, probably sooner than later. His wife and daughter had been taking care of him as he got weaker and sicker. And while he certainly appreciated it, the reality is it really bothered him. I mean, he was a tough guy, and he was used to being the person who took care of other people, not the other way around. But more than that, the worst part of him getting sick was he hadn't been able to fly a plane in months. So Deke was like a legend in the aviation community. As a young man, he'd been in the Air Force, and he'd flown in World War II combat missions, some of the most harrowing aerial combat in recorded history. And Deke had loved being up high and looking down at the world from his cockpit so much that after the war was over, he'd gone one step further, to space. And he had not just become a regular astronaut. He'd been on NASA's first team of astronauts to literally ever go to space. And then after he had gotten too old for space trips, he continued to work for NASA in various capacities until his retirement 10 years ago. But retiring had not meant he just stopped, aerial travel completely. I mean, he was done flying into space, but he still flew planes. In fact, he was a hugely successful amateur air racer, which is a competitive sport where aircraft race one another through basically an aerial obstacle course. And so now, as Deke's life was sort of slipping through his fingers, all he found himself wanting to do was just go fly. He had this plane called a Stinger, which he used for racing. It was this red, small plane that was super loud, pretty unique, but he loved this plane, and he just constantly fantasized about getting back in the cockpit and going for a ride. However, Deke did know that because of his tumor, realistically, him flying a plane would not be safe. His speech was shaky, and he was tired all the time. Also, his balance and decision-making were affected. And then on top of the physical limitations from his tumor, also there was the reality that his Stinger plane was currently in storage. But as Deke laid in bed that night, feeling just physically awful and, literally feeling his life sort of slipping away, all he wanted was just one more time to fly. And it just became so overpowering, that desire to fly again, that he decided while he was laying there that tomorrow, first thing in the morning, whether I am sick or not, I am getting up, I am taking my Stinger out of storage, and I am going for a ride. Early the next morning, at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, which was over 1,500 miles away from where Deke lived, an airport manager stepped into his office, ready to start his shift. He worked for the airport's noise abatement department, which was responsible for making sure that the planes that flew in and out didn't make too much noise and drive the neighbors crazy. And usually, this early in the morning, things were pretty calm and uneventful. But today, as soon as the manager got into his office, he heard his desk phone ring. And when he answered it, the person on the other end said they were a local resident and they wanted to make a complaint. There had just been a plane flying low over her house, making a ton of noise. The manager immediately looked over at the clock and saw it was just before 8 a.m., which meant that the plane that this resident was complaining about was in violation of the airport's curfew. John Wayne Airport had a policy where they didn't let any planes take off before 8 a.m. on Sundays, specifically to avoid this, to avoid bothering the locals too early. And so on the phone, this, perturbed resident gave a description of the aircraft, which was a small, red racing Stinger. And so the manager took some notes, hung up, and was about to, start making some phone calls when their phone rang again. And it was another resident with basically the exact same complaint. And then after that, this manager got more and more calls all about this red plane. And all the people who were complaining basically said they had heard it, they had seen it. It was like doing these crazy aerial maneuvers, but now it was gone. So they were calling sort of after the fact. It's gone now, but it was really, really disruptive. Some of the callers actually said that at certain points, this plane, when they saw it, had flown so low, they were able to read its identification number, and they had written it down to report it. And so they told the manager that it was N21X. That was the number on this plane. And so at some point, when the manager had a chance, in between all these calls they were getting, they looked up on their computer to see who this plane was registered to, using that number, N21X. And when they saw whose plane this was, the manager was shocked. This was Deke Slayton's plane. The manager knew Deke. I mean, everybody did. And it was very surprising to him that somebody like Deke, who was a consummate professional, would be flying around so recklessly outside of curfew. I mean, that's crazy. So on his computer, the manager pulled up the morning's readings from the airport's noise monitors. And when the manager saw the readings, he could see very clearly that at least 3 monitors had gone way up at the same time the residents all said they saw Deke's plane. And so at this point, the manager knew that because of these noise recordings, which corroborated the reports, that he would have to send, the legend himself, Deke, a formal note about doing this. I mean, he was basically going to have to reprimand Deke. However, based on all the reports and also on those monitors which measured the noise in the area, it seemed apparent that Deke, whatever he was doing, he was done doing it now because he was out of the airspace. And so, this manager would have to reprimand him, but there wasn't a huge urgency. But he would have to do it eventually. So the manager printed out the noise recordings, put them on his stack of things to do, and then just went about his day. 15 days later, that manager finally got around to actually sending that warning to Deke. And when Deke's wife got that letter and read its contents, she was so confused because what this airport was claiming Deke did was literally impossible. It would turn out there was literally no way Deke Slayton could have been flying his Stinger over the California skies on that day, because the storage location that was holding Deke's plane was actually a museum in Nevada. He'd given the Stinger to them 3 years ago, and it hadn't moved since. And just to make it clear here, they had removed the engine from the Stinger and then hung the Stinger from the rafters in this museum. Like, this thing is not flyable, at least not quickly. But more than the logistics of how quickly could he get the plane out of the museum, put the engine back in, and make it fly ready, beyond that, that's a huge problem. But the other, far bigger reason that it was truly impossible that Deke was the one flying that plane, even though clearly it was his plane, the tail number said as much. The reason it couldn't have been him is because 5 full hours before that recorded flight, Deke had passed away in his sleep. No one has ever been able to explain how Deke's red Stinger plane ended up over the skies of California that morning. It just doesn't make any sense. And today, that warning letter that the manager from the John Wayne Airport sent to Deke, that ultimately his wife got and was so confused by, that letter actually sits on display at the Deke Slayton Memorial Space Museum. One morning in June of 1972, a hospital administrator named Harold Michaels ran down the hallway of the Alameda Hospital in California. He was totally out of breath. He was going as fast as he could, and as he turned the corner, he nearly knocked over a gurney, but he didn't even stop to apologize to the person who was pushing it. He just kept on running as fast as he could until he got to the cafeteria, where all the nurses and doctors were eating before they started their morning shift. And as soon as he got in there, totally out of breath, he just yelled out to everybody to, "Hey, pay attention, I have a very important announcement." And so immediately, the room goes silent, all the staff, they turn to look to see what's going on here. And all he said was, "The hospital needs to update its disaster plan." But as Harold paused for a second to catch his breath and let this information sort of be soaked in by the audience, he looked around and he saw pretty much everybody was looking back at him with just looks of total confusion on their face. And Harold definitely understood why they might react that way, because there really was no clear reason for Harold to be suddenly barging in here and demanding they update this plan. There hadn't been any recent mass casualty events or, natural disasters or anything. This was just a normal day at the hospital. But here Harold was acting like there was some disaster at hand. And so there was this moment of wait, are you serious? What's going on here? But before anybody could really ask any questions, he just said, "Look, I want to make sure we are capable of handling a mass casualty event, an emergency. We need to have a better plan in place in case something really terrible happens. We don't want to be caught flat-footed." And so again, there was a sort of pause, and everyone's still looking back at Harold what's prompting this? And at some point, before anybody moved, somebody raised their hand and they were like, "Why?" But Harold, he was not having it. He just said, stop everything you're doing. Put your breakfasts away. I don't care what you think about this. Right now, go update the disaster plan. 8 months later, on the morning of February 7th, 1973, Harold sat around a conference table with the members of the hospital's disaster committee. They'd been holding meetings every month since the previous summer to update their emergency procedures. And just 2 days ago, at an all-staff meeting, they had unveiled the new disaster plan that Harold had frantically demanded. And so every doctor and nurse and clerk at the hospital had been briefed on the new procedures, and there was a drill scheduled for the very next morning to practice what to do. And Harold should have felt calmer knowing that they were now, officially prepared, at least more so than they had been before he demanded the update. But when the meeting wrapped, all Harold could focus on was this sort of nameless feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. But after work that day, he still drove home, he ate dinner, and, sat on his couch and tried to relax, but he just couldn't. Fast forward to about 8:30 that night, and Harold was running out of his house, leaping in his car, and driving as fast as he could back to the hospital. He had just gotten a phone call from the hospital saying that he had to come back here right away. And when he got to the hospital, he saw there was a line of police officers directing traffic, and there were EMTs and firefighters rushing bleeding patients into the building on stretchers. I mean, it was madness. When Harold made it inside, the ER was bustling with nurses rolling gurneys down the halls and prepping extra beds and carrying these big boxes of blood packs from the local blood bank. Harold counted at least 6 full surgical teams standing around, scrubbed and ready to go before any patients had even arrived. And then at this point, a nurse grabbed Harold and told him that the hospital's phone lines had gone down about 30 minutes ago, but more than 100 off-duty doctors and staff members had shown up immediately when they heard the news, without even waiting to be officially called in. And when they got to the hospital, they went straight to their stations and knew exactly what to do because they'd all been preparing for that big disaster drill in the morning. And so as Harold is standing here sort of processing the scene, he watched as EMTs wheeled in a man with third-degree burns all over his body, and right away a team of doctors swooped in and guided him into a trauma room. And the rest of the doctors all waited in an orderly line to take over the next patients as soon as they came through the doors. And Harold couldn't help but feel really vindicated. And also a little spooked, because this was all happening exactly as he knew it would. It would turn out on that morning, months earlier, when Harold bolted into the cafeteria and told everybody to stop what they were doing and update the disaster plan. Well, that morning, Harold had woken up from this incredibly lucid, vivid dream, perhaps the most vivid dream he had had in his whole life. In this dream, a plane had crashed into the middle of the city, leaving hundreds of people dead and horribly injured, and it was basically up to his hospital to save people. And so that was why he'd been so insistent that morning on updating the emergency plan, because he felt like if that really happened, like in the dream, if there was a plane crash, I don't know if we have the capacity to handle it. Like that many patients all at once, I don't know if we can do that. And so we better update things right now. And so fast forward 8 months to February 7th, 1973, literally just hours before Harold's hospital was going to conduct a drill to practice the new disaster plan they'd come up with, a Navy jet had smashed into a 4-story apartment building in the middle of the city. But because of Harold's dream, which ultimately, prompted him to force his hospital to update their disaster plan, because of that, well, when this actual plane crash happened, Harold's hospital and his whole staff were ready. Initial estimates at the crash scene had predicted at least 50 people would die. But thanks to Harold's staff and their updated disaster plan, only 11 people actually did. One night in May of 1896, a young opera singer sat inside of her dressing room at the Palais Garnier, which is this huge, beautiful theater in Paris, France. A little while earlier, she'd finished a performance of a very famous opera, and now she was getting changed and taking off her makeup. However, as she was doing this, she suddenly heard this sound in the theater that immediately sent goosebumps up and down her body. It sounded like a man was singing somewhere out there, and his voice was very deep and very sad. And really, it wasn't so much the sound of the voice that was so unsettling. It was just the fact that she was hearing anybody in the theater at all. I mean, she should have been alone in the theater. As far as she knew, all of the other performers and crew members had already gone home. So who was this? And so she left her room and she stepped out into the hallway and just began looking around, thinking maybe one of the other opera singers had maybe stayed behind without her knowing. But she didn't see anybody else backstage. And as she listened carefully to, again, this man who was still singing somewhere in the theater, she realized that the voice was actually coming from below her. And this revelation made her go from just being unsettled to being genuinely scared. So before she had ever worked in this theater, she'd actually heard a rumor about this theater. It was said that for the past several years, a man had been secretly living inside of this theater. And apparently, this same man had been horribly injured in a fire at a different theater that was nearby. And now he was, too scared to show his face in public. So he squatted in the basement and the walls of the Palais Garnier and only ever came out at night when he believed he was alone. Now, this woman, this young opera singer, had always assumed that, this was just obviously some legend made up to scare people or maybe even to entice people to come to this theater. But now, standing in the hallway and clearly hearing this strange, sad voice echoing up from beneath her feet, she really couldn't help but feel like maybe this story is true, and how terrifying a thought that was. However, as she stood there listening to this voice, she sort of slowly began to convince herself that maybe it actually wasn't a man's voice. Maybe this was the sound of water moving through the pipes or something like that. I mean, to be honest, the sound was sort of far away. And she's thinking, maybe I'm convincing myself this is an actual person's voice. Maybe it's not. And so she's sitting there listening, and sure enough, after a couple of minutes, she really had convinced herself that, no, this is not a person. This is just like late night sounds the theater makes, and I'm not really here a lot by myself, and I've never heard this before, so this is nothing. And so she quickly, because she told herself she was convinced of this, but deep down she wasn't, but she quickly went back into her dressing room, she gathered up her things, and she left for the night. A few days later, on the evening of May 20th, that same young opera singer was waiting in the wings just off stage. She and the rest of the cast were in the middle of a performance, and she was waiting for her cue to go on stage. But as she was watching the show from backstage, she suddenly saw movement above the stage, way up in the rafters. And she looked up and she saw there was a man in dark clothes who was up there. Now, at first, she thought, maybe this man is a stagehand. But as she continued to look at him, she realized he wasn't doing anything. He was just crouched up there, sort of hiding from everybody else, just sort of staring down at the performance, like he was watching the performance. But then, as this young opera singer is staring up at this guy, he suddenly turned and looked right at her. And this young singer, she had to hold back a gasp because this man's face was obviously just totally disfigured by what appeared to be burn scars. And so terrified, this woman turns, she rushes and grabs a crew member, and she points up into the rafters and says there's somebody up there. But when they both looked up again, the man in dark clothes with the burned face was gone. Now, the young singer, she felt certain that what she had seen just moments before was real. But the crew member was looking at her like, are you sure you saw that? Like, this seems pretty far-fetched. Like, why would anyone be up there? Certainly not some random person. Like, what are you talking about? And so she didn't know what to do. But the show she was in had to go on. About an hour later, the young singer was standing on stage and bowing in front of a crowd of nearly 2,000 people. She and the rest of the cast had just finished performing Act 1, and the young singer had barely made it through the performance because she was still so shaken up by what she had seen backstage, up in the rafters. All she wanted to do was get off stage and spend intermission calming down. But now, even though it was only the end of Act 1, the crowd was so excited and they loved the performance. She had just done so much. They were calling for her, specifically her, to do an encore of her last aria. The singer knew she didn't really have a choice. So she nodded to the conductor and then reluctantly stepped forward and restarted the piece. And as she sang, her anxiety actually began to melt away. She let herself get lost in the music, she closed her eyes, and she belted a high note. But suddenly, she heard this ear-splitting bang and she opened her eyes just in time to see a brief flash of light. Then she watched in horror as the giant glass chandelier that hung above the audience came crashing down and landed directly on top of a woman, killing her instantly. Police immediately launched an investigation into the falling chandelier, but quickly determined that the whole thing was really just a freak accident. They said that one of the chandelier's candles had caused a small fire, which had melted the cord that held it up and caused it to fall. But the young singer, she didn't believe this, because she'd seen that burned man in the rafters just, less than an hour before the disaster, and she couldn't help but feel like he was to blame. And her theory, as wild as it sounded, actually gained traction. Eventually, a journalist named Gaston Leroux heard about it and started his own investigation. He spent weeks searching for the burned man, even showing up unannounced at the theater at different times of day and night to try to catch him. But he never did. However, Gaston did track down some construction workers who had helped build the theater 20 years earlier, and they claimed they knew exactly who the burned man was. So before the Palais Garnier was built, there had been another theater right down the block. But that theater had been completely destroyed by a fire 20 years earlier in 1873. On the night of that fire, a young pianist named Ernest had been inside the building, working on a wedding march for his fiancée, who was a ballerina at the theater. Out of nowhere, he began to smell smoke, and then before he knew it, flames blocked his only way out. He had no choice but to run through the flames, and by doing that, he suffered terrible facial injuries, but he would survive. Unfortunately, though, his fiancée did not make it out. She died in the fire. The construction workers told Gaston that after this horrible tragedy, Ernest had sort of removed himself from society. Like, not only did the burns make it difficult for him to be in public, he was, self-conscious, but also he was racked with grief about losing his fiancée. And so they said Ernest had taken refuge in the basement of the Palais Garnier, which at this point was just under construction. And the construction workers said they heard Ernest playing the piano at all hours in this basement, obsessively trying to finish that wedding march for his fiancée. And often while he was doing this, he was screaming and crying out in agony. Now, the workers told Gaston that eventually they stopped hearing Ernest, and they assumed at that point he had left, or maybe even died. Or they said, it's possible they never heard him at all, and they had convinced themselves that they were hearing him down there. They didn't know. But then, after that, performers at the now finished Palais Garnier reported hearing this sad voice singing after hours in the building. And some even reported seeing a scarred man, the scars on his face, creeping around the dark corners of the theater. But when these people would periodically investigate to see where it was coming from and who is that, nobody was ever there. And so after hearing this story from these construction workers, Gaston Leroux, the journalist, was, sort of conflicted in a way. On the one hand, he was sort of disturbed by, these two tragedies separated by 20 years. You have the fire that claimed the life of Ernest's fiancée and, apparently badly hurt Ernest. And then you have this chandelier falling and killing a guest at the theater at the Palais Garnier 20 years later. So that was horrible. That was tragic. But more than that, the feeling that Gaston had was that he felt sort of deeply moved by the story of Ernest's love for his fiancée. Whether or not the story was even true, whether or not he really did go into the basement as construction was being done and, try to finish that song for his dead fiancée. It didn't really matter. It was like that combined with these rumors of there being, this ghost in the theater. It was just kind of moving. The idea that, poor Ernest and his fiancée. That's what stuck out to the journalist. And so ultimately, Gaston ended up writing a book about this story, and the book was then adapted into one of the most famous musicals of all time. Today, Ernest is more often known by the nickname that Gaston Leroux gave him, the Phantom of the Opera. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On September 29, 1939, a British intelligence agent walked through the door of the Royal Navy headquarters in London with an envelope tucked under his arm. When he stepped inside, a doorman stopped him and asked to see his pass. The agent flashed a badge that identified himself by the codename 17F, and the doorman simply nodded and let him through. Agent 17F then continued farther into the building, and he went down this long, silent white hallway to a black door with the number 39 painted on it. After looking around to make sure nobody was watching him, he reached down and he turned the handle and pushed the door open. And right away, he was hit by this brightly lit office, and inside it was absolutely chaotic. The air was full of smoke from tobacco, telephones were ringing off the hook, typewriters were clattering away, and men in dark suits were rushing back and forth. This was the office of Great Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, and World War II had just broken out just a few weeks ago, so everything was nuts. The spies that worked in this office were literally out gathering intel and analyzing data and also coming up with creative, sort of crazy ways to literally trick the enemy. Now, Agent 17F was not actually an intelligence agent. He was the director's personal assistant, so he had no spy training. But he was very creative and had a way of coming up with schemes that were so crazy they just might work. And that really was a skill the department desperately needed right now. The director was really practical and analytical and pragmatic, and so he sort of liked having someone around in his personal assistant, 17F, whose thought patterns were just much more colorful. I mean, he really thought differently than the director. So Agent 17F very casually walked into this chaotic room, and he strolled across the floor, and he reached the director's door, and he knocked. And a moment later, the director called for him to come in, and 17F walked inside, walked right over to the desk where the director was sitting, and he dropped that envelope he was carrying right on the desk. And the director picked it up, he opened the envelope, and started reading what was inside. And as the director's eyes scanned the page, Agent 17F couldn't help but see what looked like an annoyed look come across the director's face. So inside the envelope was a list of ideas that 17F had come up with for spreading misinformation to the Germans. Basically, they were ways to confuse and misdirect the German military by giving them fake information about what the British were up to. Now, this is a very normal thing that virtually every military does during a time of war. But these specific strategies that Agent 17F had come up with on this list were really out there. I mean, even for his own standards, these were sort of wild. For example, on this list, there was included this idea to have the British drop soccer balls covered in reflective paint into the ocean so that enemy submarines would, mistake them for explosives. There was another suggestion to put fake intelligence messages into literal bottles and just set them loose at sea and hope Germans found them. 17F also said he wanted to mail out fake copies of the Times newspaper with made-up news stories and made-up headlines to, again, sort of trick their enemy. And so Agent 17F had been pretty excited to share this list with the director. I mean, he was proud of these ideas. But now, looking at the director, it seemed like he was just getting really frustrated. And so 17F wondered if maybe he had pushed it too far. But just then, the director stopped and clearly was fixated on one particular idea on this list. And he looked up at 17F and he said, actually, this one seems workable. So the idea that the director liked was actually based on something that happened in a crime novel that Agent 17F had read. Agent 17F was suggesting that they borrow a corpse from the naval hospital, dress it in a British pilot's uniform, and put fake dispatches in its pockets with details of a supposed military operation. They then put a faulty parachute on the corpse's back and fly over the German coast and drop the corpse out onto the beach. And when the Germans found the corpse, the idea was that they would obviously assumed that this was an actual pilot who had died when his parachute failed. And then if they believed that, well, they'd very likely believe that the information the British agents planted in the corpse's pockets were actual military secrets that they'd intercepted. And so in the end, the director told Agent 17F that, you know what, this is actually pretty good. You did a good job after all. And so by the time Agent 17F left the director's office and walked over to his own desk in the corner, he was feeling proud that at least one of his big swings had potentially landed. 4 years later, at a pivotal moment in World War II, the British put a version of 17F's plan into action. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and amazingly, it worked. British spies did plant a corpse out on the beach with the faulty parachute, with documents in its pockets saying that the Allied powers of America and Britain were going to invade Greece and Sardinia, which prompted the Germans to move a ton of their troops away from the Allies' real target, which was the island of Sicily. Sicily is part of Italy, and Italy was allied with Germany during World War II. And so thanks in part to Operation Mincemeat, 17F's big idea, the Germans were totally caught off guard by the invasion of Sicily, and the Allies captured the entire island. This then paved the way for an invasion of mainland Italy, which was a major turning point in the war. And again, it was all because of this one idea inspired by Agent 17F. Now, to be clear, Agent 17F was not personally there for the invasion, and he didn't publicly get credit for his role in planning it, even though Operation Mincemeat would become pretty famous. But anonymity was super important for anyone working in intelligence, which 17F was. And when the war ended, 17F might have stayed a ghost forever. But one slow afternoon at the end of the war, when the chaos in Room 39 had died down and there were only a couple dozen people still working out of that office, Agent 17F was sitting at his desk in the corner, and the other agents nearby were talking to each other about what they were going to do next. And Agent 17F, even though he wasn't a part of their conversation, internally he sort of asked himself the same question, like, what am I going to do next? I mean, he was so good at coming up with these wild ideas, and he really had so much fun doing it. Like, how could he just stop doing that and go have a normal job? Like, this was his calling. Doing what he did now is the only thing he wanted to do. But then he realized as he was sitting there that maybe he didn't have to stop doing this. After the war, for years, Agent 17F kept on coming up with fantastical spy ideas. But this time, instead of giving these ideas to the government, he wrote them all down with the intention of someday making a book around these ideas. And finally, in 1953, he published the first book under his real name, Ian Fleming. And his book was wildly successful, and he went on to write more books all about this same character who was a spy. And that spy's name was James Bond. One fall afternoon in 1830, a beaver trapper named Smith and his hunting partner, whose name was Bauman, hiked through the Bitterroot Mountains, which is a section of the Rocky Mountains in southwestern Montana. Now, where they were headed was this remote pond deep in the woods that was rumored to be full of beavers. However, despite that, nobody really ever dared to go there, because the area was also said to be cursed. Now, the reasoning behind, this rumor, the cursed rumor, is that about a year ago, a hunter had traveled to the pond on his own and he'd never come back home. And eventually miners had passed through that area and they found his body, and his body had basically been torn to shreds and actually partially eaten. And so naturally, rumors had begun to spread that, this pond was home to some kind of man-eating monster. But Smith and Bauman, they didn't believe in curses or monsters. They believed in money and they knew that they'd make a lot of money from all the beavers they would catch at this pond. And so after several hours of hiking through the forest, Smith and Bauman did finally arrive at this cursed pond, and they hurried to set up their camp. They gathered firewood and they built a lean-to where they would stay for the next few nights. And then after that, they set up a few beaver traps around the pond and then followed this nearby stream several miles uphill and set up beaver traps along the way. And so when they were done setting all these traps, it was around sunset, Smith and Bauman decided to head back to their camp, the lean-to they had set up, and make some dinner and then go to bed. And so down the hill they went, and they're getting closer and closer to their campsite. And keep in mind, there's nobody else out here. They are in the middle of the forest. And as they're approaching their campsite, when they got within range and could actually see it, they just stopped. Because their lean-to they had put together as soon as they got there, their lean-to and all their gear had basically been torn to shreds. It's like their campsite had a tornado come through it, and everything was just kind of all over the place. And there was no people, no animals, no nothing. It was like something had happened while they were up the hill setting up these traps. Now, Smith and Bauman, their reaction was not, oh my goodness, like a monster came through here. They're like, great, a bear must have come through, because bears were in this area. So this is like a nuisance at this point. This is not confirmation that the pond is haunted and that there's a monster here. They're just like, great, we got to reset up our camp now. So the two men walked over to their destroyed campsite and began rebuilding it. But as they were, putting their lean-to back together and, packaging up their gear back into their bags, something really stood out that was pretty odd. So they're thinking that a bear must have come through here. And why would a bear come through here? Why would a bear tear all this stuff apart? Well, because the bear would be looking for food, as bears are known to do. But as they're packaging things up, both Smith and Bauman are seeing that none of their food was taken. Like, no food has been taken, and quite a bit of it was out in the open. So there certainly was opportunity, but it wasn't. And so they're thinking, that's so weird. Like, clearly a big effort was made to look through the campsite for something. It wasn't like an animal came over and just batted it around and then left. There had to be a reason. Like, what were they looking for? Like, what's going on here? That's so odd. But both men figured that what likely had happened here was, as they were coming back down the hill, this bear must have heard them and ran off before taking their food. And so ultimately they felt like they had just gotten really lucky here. And so Bauman went to go start a campfire to make their dinner, and Smith finished putting back together their lean-to camp. But just a little while later, as Smith reconstructed their lean-to, he couldn't shake the feeling that there really was something odd about whatever had happened here. They had this explanation that maybe they got lucky, but it just felt sort of weird, especially considering that there was lots of lore about this place being kind of dangerous to people. Forget whether it's a curse or a monster. There was just a fear that something odd was going on here. And so Smith, he said to Bauman, hey, I'm just gonna, for my own sanity here, look around and just look for tracks. Let's confirm that this really was a bear. And so, Bauman's like, great, go for it. He's, setting up the fire. And Smith, began walking away from the campsite looking for tracks. However, after stepping just a few feet away from, the campfire and their campsite, Smith realized it was just too dark out to actually see anything on the ground. So he went back to the campsite, he grabbed a torch, and he lit it in the fire that Bauman had made. And then now, with this light source, he left the campsite and began scanning the ground, looking for, the tracks from this bear. And at first, he didn't see anything. There were no tracks. It was just, some broken leaves, and there were some broken sticks and some, brush that had been sort of trampled over that suggested an animal had come through here. But again, there were no tracks. And so he's walking farther and farther away from their campsite until he gets to this clearing that was actually not very far from their campsite. But in this clearing, he found some tracks. There were these massive paw prints that were in the ground, tracks from this animal with huge claws, like massive, massive paws that certainly suggested this was a bear. And in a way, this was sort of reassuring for Smith, because ultimately he was going out here to confirm that this was a bear, right? This wasn't anything else, this was a bear. But as he's looking at these tracks and watching them sort of meander their way through this clearing and, back off into the woods, he noticed something strange about these tracks. Yes, they were paw prints that certainly suggested they were a bear. But the way they were landing in the ground suggested it was just 2 paws, not 4. And a bear walks on all 4. Whatever creature was leaving behind these prints was walking on 2 legs. Bears don't do that. And so Smith couldn't help but feel like a little unnerved. I mean, he's seeing clear as day prints of a bipedal creature with huge paws, huge claws, walking around near their campsite. I mean, what did this? Is this a bear? He knew bears could get up on their hind legs, but they don't walk very far on just their hind legs. And so this was unsettling. And again, as much as he wasn't scared of, the curse or monsters that were out here, it was hard not to think, like, is there truth to that stuff? And so Smith, sort of rattled, he turns around and hustles back to the campsite, and he tells Bauman, I found tracks, and I think it's bear tracks. But whatever it is walking around on 2 legs. I'm telling you, it's 2 legs. There's no 4-legged creature walking around. And Bauman laughed. He actually thought that Smith was just like playing a joke on him, like, you're trying to scare me out here, right? But Smith is like, I'm not joking. Like, I'm telling you, the tracks 100% are of an animal walking around on 2 legs. And it appears to be an enormous bear, And, Bauman at this point, he's like, well, bears can walk on their hind legs, but both of them are like, yeah, but again, not for long periods of time. And so the 2 men really didn't know what to make of this. I mean, by this point, their campsite was set back up. They had their fire, their things are sort of back to normal, and they're not hearing any animals or anything odd in the vicinity. And so pretty quickly, they both were like, well, I guess that was just a standing bear. Hopefully it doesn't come back. And they just sat down by the fire and ate their dinner. So after dinner, the 2 men eventually did decide to just go to sleep. They were sort of in denial about the weirdness that was going on at their campsite, but they had both sort of, without saying anything, elected to just not talk about it and just bury those feelings and just ignore this gut instinct, this almost primal instinct that something was off here. And so the 2 men, they climbed into their lean-to tent together, and they lied down next to each other, and eventually they drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, when Smith and Bauman were both fast asleep inside of this lean-to right next to each other, there was this loud, almost moaning sound coming from somewhere in the forest. And it was loud enough that it woke both Smith and Bauman up. And so they sit up inside of their lean-to. It's dark, but they can basically see each other. And they're sort of saying to each other, like, hey, did you hear that? Like, what was that? Neither of them knew, but now they're sort of on edge. And they're sitting in their lean-to, obviously thinking about the fact that, this bear or whatever it was had clearly come through here the day before. They're hoping it's not coming back. And they're sitting there listening really intently to the noises coming from the forest. And there are regular night noises, all across the forest, bugs and birds and animals, that kind of thing. But as they're straining to listen, they can hear something huge is making its way through the tree line in their direction. And so Bauman sort of reflexively grabbed his rifle and, he's just holding onto his rifle, wondering what he's going to do. And Smith, too, is sort of not sure what to do. And then at some point, as whatever this is got close enough to their lean-to, they can't see it. They're too scared to poke their head out to look, but they know it's getting closer. When it got close enough, they began to smell whatever it was. It was like this musty earth smell. And as the 2 men are like getting ready to actually make a plan about what to do, like obviously this thing is back, whatever it is, they hear the noise again that woke them up, but now it's literally coming from right outside of their lean-to. And it's this guttural, loud, almost like human moaning sound, but it's definitely not a person. It's just this eerie, low rumbling sound, and it's right outside the tent. And Bauman, as soon as he heard this, he just turned and he aimed his rifle and fired basically roughly in the direction of where this thing was, which again is right outside their lean-to. And as soon as he fired, both men heard the sound of this huge creature right outside their lean-to turn and start running into the forest, just bounding through the trees. Trees are crashing. It's this totally chaotic sound as this huge thing is retreating into the woods. And then at some point, all the noise stops and they don't hear it again. And the 2 men are like so frightened by whatever this was. It certainly didn't feel like a bear. They had not smelled something like that. They had certainly not heard a sound like that. And just the way it was moving, it was so agile and so huge and did sound like something that was walking sort of upright. Like even just the steps it was taking right outside their lean-to, it didn't sound like a typical animal moving around. This was different. And so the two men, they're terrified and they're just up all night, waiting for this thing to come back. By the time the sun finally rose the next morning, Smith was so anxious and so exhausted that he actually felt sick. He didn't want to leave the campsite because this trip was ultimately about making money and they had not caught any beavers yet, so this was not a profitable trip yet. But if they left now, they definitely wouldn't be catching anything, and this really would be a net loss. However, both he and Bauman both agreed that, whatever kind of creature here kept coming back to their campsite, it certainly did not act, walk, or sound like a bear. Whatever it was, clearly it was dangerous. So ultimately, what Bauman and Smith decide to do is they are going to basically wrap up this trip early, but first, they're going to go check all those beaver traps they had set, both around the pond and up the hill next to that stream. But normally they would do this together, and it would take a really long time to go to each and every trap and check it, and if there was a beaver in there to work through that. So what they decided to do instead, in order to be expeditious and be really quick, is they would split up. It's broad daylight. They figured they were safe here from whatever this creature was, and they would split up. They would divide and conquer, check all the traps, and then meet back at the campsite before it was dark, pack up, and leave. A little while later, Bauman had finished checking all the traps that he was responsible for, and he had come back with 3 beavers over his shoulder, and he was feeling pretty good. He was pretty quick checking his traps. He's thinking, great, our plan's gonna work. I bet Smith is done too. We can pack up and get out of here, hopefully really soon. And so he's walking towards the campsite, and he can see it up ahead. And at first glance, everything looked to be in normal order. The lean-to was still set up, and he could see there was some gear stacked up on the ground. And so as Bauman got closer to the camp, he began calling out to his friend, to Smith. And Smith didn't call back. Now, Bauman didn't really know if Smith was actually back to the campsite yet. He could still be out checking his traps. So Bauman, he walks into the campsite, and Smith is not there. But that gear that he saw from a distance sort of stacked up in the middle of the campsite, well, it was Smith's gear, and he had packed it all up and stacked it there, which certainly suggested that Smith had finished checking his traps, had packed his stuff, and had to be nearby, like he was getting ready to leave too. And so Bauman's thinking, okay, I just gotta find him. Maybe he walked off somewhere as he's waiting for me. And so Bauman, he puts his beavers down and continues calling out for Smith, just sort of wandering around, the rough vicinity of the campsite, hoping to find Smith. But Smith never calls back. And Bauman's getting a little worried. Again, they're obviously on edge here. Some weird things have been happening here. That creature obviously totally freaked them out. And so, Bauman is yelling louder and louder, and he's sort of moving faster and faster, trying to find some sign of where Smith went. And at some point, Bauman makes his way into that clearing where the night before, Smith had actually found those tracks that showed, this bipedal creature moving around. And when Bauman made his way into that clearing, he just stopped. Because the first thing he saw is there was blood all over this clearing. It was like a bloodbath everywhere. And then on the other side of the clearing, sort of draped up against this tree, was like this heap of meat. That heap of meat was Smith. Smith had been absolutely ripped to shreds. Like his body was just destroyed. His limbs were all in different directions. Like he was ripped to pieces. And Bauman, he didn't even have to go over to check to see if he was dead. He was definitely dead. There's no creature in the area. It's totally silent, eerily silent. And Bauman, he's just staring at his friend, wondering, what does he even do? But as he's standing there staring at this just horrific scene, something else clicked. If it had been an animal that attacked his friend Smith, if an animal was responsible for this, it likely would have eaten Smith, or there would have been signs that Smith was eaten by this animal. But Smith had no signs of predation. Smith had no signs that an animal was trying to eat him. His whole body was just ripped apart, like whatever killed him just wanted to kill him and basically fling him around like a toy as he was being killed. And so at this point, almost like instinctively, Bauman knew two things. One, the creature clearly killed Smith. There was no other explanation that made sense here. He didn't understand, why or even how, but the creature had to have done this. And two, the creature was not a bear. Couldn't have been a bear. There's too many obvious signs that what they're dealing with here is not a bear or really any animal he had ever run into. And then also, sort of a third thing was, Bauman's thinking, I wasn't that far away. Like this horrifically violent attack, it sort of happened silently or just fast enough that, Smith didn't have time to scream. It's like this creature killed almost surgically, despite the sort of gratuitous nature of the scene. And so all that said to Bauman is he needed to leave right now. And so he literally left his friend, he left all the supplies, he just turned and fled. Over the next several decades, Bauman just lied about what happened to Smith. He told people that while they were out there, Smith was attacked and killed by a bear. And the reason he did that and did not tell people that, well, it was some bipedal monster that, wandered the woods and slaughtered my friend, the reason he didn't say that is because he felt like nobody would believe him, that he would look crazy. And that, of course, like he's feeding into this rumor that this particular area is cursed and there's a monster out there. He just didn't think people would take him seriously. So he kept it to himself. That was until about 40 years later when Bauman met this man that he felt like he could trust with his real story. This man was an avid hunter, and he was collecting unique stories for a book he was writing about wilderness exploration. And to Bauman, it felt like his story was a fit. So Bauman told him the truth. He told him all about, what they experienced out there and, the fact that he did not believe it was a bear. He felt like it was a monster, if you will. And this man who's hearing this story took Bauman really seriously. He took detailed notes as Bauman was recounting this, horrific thing, and then he ultimately published Bauman's account in his book. In the book, the writer described this creature that Bauman and Smith encountered in the woods as, quote, something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast. Now, to modern audiences, when you hear the details of the story, the one I've just shared with you, the monster really sounds an awful lot like Bigfoot, or at least something Bigfoot adjacent. But the writer published this book, published Bauman's account, in 1893, which was more than 60 years before the term Bigfoot even existed. So today, Bigfoot believers cite this book, in particular Bauman's experience, as one of the very first documented accounts ever of a monster that is now ubiquitous. But the writer of this book did not go down in history as, being remembered for documenting Bigfoot essentially for the first time, or at least before anybody knew, what Bigfoot was. No. Instead, the writer would go down in history for what he did 8 years after publishing that book. That was when he was elected as America's 26th president. The writer was Theodore Roosevelt. On the morning of July 23, 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus paced back and forth near an art exhibit in Riverside Park in Chester-le-Street, England. And Maurice was frustrated because this was supposed to be one of the biggest days of his entire 40-year career as an artist. Right now, his exhibit, his masterpiece, should be full of people, but it wasn't. So Maurice's exhibit was called Dream Space. It was this massive structure about half the size of a soccer field, and inside of it was the sprawling network of small, colorful, interconnected rooms. Dream Space was designed so that visitors could sort of wander from room to room and be affected by the music and soothing lighting and have kind of an immersive, serene experience. And this was by far the largest physical exhibit that Maurice had ever done. So it had taken a lot of preparation, and naturally there had been some construction hiccups, but it was all going to be worth it because Maurice knew it was about to be seen by a lot of people since it was located in a really big public park. However, before they could actually open, there was still one more hiccup to deal with. This morning, when Maurice had arrived, he'd realized that part of his exhibit had not been set up correctly. So he and his staff had spent the last few hours rushing around to fix everything and add some finishing touches to the exterior. And Maurice knew they really needed to hurry here because making these changes had already taken up way too much time and they were already late in opening the exhibit. Maurice could see that there were guests who had already purchased tickets who were lining up at the entrance to get into Dreamspace. And they looked confused and sort of annoyed about why they weren't inside already. And so naturally, Maurice was afraid that if he didn't wrap this up soon and start letting people in, these people would just start leaving, which meant they would not get to see how amazing his masterpiece was, and that would be just devastating. So at this point, Maurice just stepped back and he looked at what he and his staff had done so far in terms of fixes. And he decided that, things were looking good enough. They'd addressed the major issues that he had. And even though Maurice was ultimately a perfectionist and would have liked to do even more additions, just getting Dreamspace open at this point was way more important. So Maurice told his staff to stop what they were doing and go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. A few hours later, around 3:15 p.m., 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings walked into Riverside Park with her 14-year-old grandson. They lived in the area, and they had just decided to take a walk together in the park. And Elizabeth was glad they had. It was like the perfect summer day. There was a light breeze. It was very sunny and warm. And so with the wind rustling her hair and her grandson happily walking beside her, she felt very at peace. But just then, her grandson stopped and sort of broke her peace by telling her to, "Hey, look at this." And Elizabeth turned and looked, where her grandson was pointing. And she saw on the other side of the park, there was this sprawling, colorful structure with a huge line of people out front and soothing music coming from its open doors. And Elizabeth thought, whatever that is, it looked really intriguing and not like anything she had ever seen before. So she was just excited as her grandson to go check it out. And so she said, "Let's go." Just a few minutes later, and Elizabeth and her grandson had purchased their tickets and actually stepped inside the exhibit. And Elizabeth knew instantly that this had been a great idea. The lights were dim inside, and the colorful walls seemed to almost glow as they went from room to room. And all around them, the dreamy, tranquil music played. And even though it was fairly crowded and pretty hot inside, it still felt quite peaceful. And Elizabeth could feel her entire body just sort of relax. And for the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered around slowly, taking in the atmosphere and the lights and the music. It was really nice. At some point, they made their way into this room which had this beautiful blue hue to it. And there was some light coming in from the room next to them, which was sort of brownish. And when the color of the room they were in and this brownish light combined, it sort of had this effect of making the room feel almost green, and then mixed with the music. It was just this really cool experience. And both Elizabeth and her grandson were just sort of transfixed, sort of taking in this really cool exhibit. But as they were taking this in, all of a sudden, there was this deafening snapping sound. And the moment that snapping sound happened, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented, and as she stared at all the colors around her, the room seemed to almost tilt, and she found herself stumbling a few steps, like the room was moving and she was losing her balance. And at first she wondered if maybe the lights and the heat were just getting to her, except then she couldn't help but have this almost floating sensation, like the room itself was moving away from her. And then she realized her feet were no longer touching the floor.
Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballinstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. That is fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show.
The creator of Dreamspace, Maurice, had been outside with the guests who were in line waiting to get into the exhibit. And so far, the day really had been going great. I mean, he had done all those last-minute changes and fixes to the exhibit, and he had sort of got it done just in time to open it up, and now all these people are here, and there's at least 40-some-odd people in line, with more and more joining, and everybody who comes out of the exhibit is, beaming and talking about what an incredible experience it was. I mean, the day had been going great for Maurice, until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud snap rang out, everybody heard it, and then Maurice, who was looking away from Dreamspace, he began hearing screams behind him. And then before he could say or do anything, he just sort of whipped around and looked, and all he saw were these shapes just falling from the sky and smashing into the ground. And at first, Maurice and everybody else around him didn't even know what they were. But then suddenly Maurice realized those shapes were people. So earlier in the day, when Maurice and his staff were sort of hustling to get all those last-minute fixes done on this exhibit so they could open it to the public, well, Maurice, who knew this was going to be his last big art exhibit, this was like the end of his career, it was supposed to be the exclamation point on a storied career here, he was so worried that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, that people in line were going to leave and not even show up, and it would be this catastrophic failure, that he ultimately basically stopped his staff from finishing all the renovations, all the fixes he needed to do, in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he sort of rationalized it was, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I would have liked to have done all the fixes, but I did enough. It's good enough. Let's get this place open. Let's send people in. The problem with that is some of the things that he overlooked in his haste to open up the front doors for the public included vital safety precautions. Some of these missed safety precautions included tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the exhibit to the ground. The staff had ultimately tied down the front of the structure, but, because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they didn't anchor the back of the exhibit. And this would turn out to be just a catastrophic oversight. Dreamspace was not a regular permanent art exhibit. It was not made of walls and concrete with a real foundation. It was an inflatable exhibit made of plastic sheeting, sort of like what shower curtains are made of. So even though there was just a light breeze going through the park that day, it was enough to sort of suddenly lift the entire Dreamspace structure out of the ground, because again, there was just a couple of anchors, not a full set of anchors, and so suddenly the wind yanks the space out of the ground. That was the snapping sound, and so basically this big structure turned into like a giant hot air balloon, and everybody inside of it, the dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were thrown 30 feet into the air, and they're all trapped inside of this plasticky structure that's contorting in the wind up at 30 feet, and as the wind picked up, the higher up they went, the Dreamspace structure, as it contorted, began ejecting all of the people inside of it out. And so that's why when Maurice looked, he saw all these people falling to the ground. In the end, 27 people were injured and 2 were killed, including Elizabeth Collings. As for Maurice Agus, the creator of Dreamspace, he was convicted of a health and safety violation and given a fine. But despite that being a relatively light punishment relative to what happened, he was so devastated by the destruction that his creation caused that he never made anything like it again. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. At 5 a.m. on December 24th, 1885, 30-year-old Samuel Wardell abruptly sat up in his bed in New York City, having just been woken up by the sound of his deafening alarm clock. And just like every other morning, Samuel immediately got up out of his bed and he trudged across the floor of his one-bedroom apartment to the shelf where his alarm clock was, and he reset it. Now, the placing of this alarm clock was very intentional. Samuel was a very, very heavy sleeper, and so by putting the clock all the way over there, it forced him to get out of bed, walk all the way across the room to reset it, and then ideally, he just wouldn't go back to bed. And for the most part, he wouldn't. Now, it can't be overstated just how heavy a sleeper Samuel actually was. In fact, he'd actually taken another step to make sure that he really could not sleep through his alarm. He'd made some additional alterations to the alarm clock that made it way louder. Now, this did seem sort of like overkill to most people who knew about it, but it was hard to argue with the results. Samuel had not been late to work in years, and that was really important because Samuel had a very early morning job that he didn't want to lose. He was a city lamplighter. In 1885, large parts of New York City still relied on gas-burning streetlights when it got dark outside. So the way it worked is there was a night shift lamplighter, not Samuel, this is somebody else, who would go around the city and light those lights at dusk. And then in the early morning hours, the morning lamplighter, Samuel, would go put them out again. And so that's why he had to get up early to go put out the lamps. And even though Samuel really didn't like getting up this early, the reality is he did need the job. And also, too, he had sort of grown fond of the job. He had a lot of fun doing it. Over the years, he'd become very friendly with basically everybody on his local route, and so he didn't mind it. You know, getting up was painful, but it was worth it. Samuel actually had become so close with the people on his route that night he was going to be throwing this big Christmas party for all these people. It was like all his friends from his job were going to come over and celebrate with him, and he was really excited about it. But that was not going to be until much later that night. You know, for now, he just needed to reset his alarm clock, get dressed, and go out and put out those lamps. Fast forward to the end of the night, and Samuel now he's done with his work, he's back home, all his friends are over, and he's pouring some ale from this big barrel that his friends had brought over for this party, and he's just having a great time. The single room of his tiny apartment was now packed with about 30 people, and they too were all having just a great time. They didn't care how small it was. This was just like an awesome party. Now, by this point, Samuel and his friends had already spent the last few hours drinking, and so they were quite drunk, but they were having a great time, laughing and eating, and everyone's just having so much fun. And so even though it was definitely getting late, and Samuel did have to work the next day, it just felt like the party was not about to end anytime soon, and Samuel was not quite ready to turn it off yet. He was having too good of a time. And so, when one of his friends randomly stood up and sort of drunkenly suggested they have an amateur boxing match, Samuel immediately voiced his approval. Along with everybody else, they cheered. They're like, yeah, let's do it. And so Samuel and the other party guests, they cleared the furniture out from, the single room, to set up the boxing ring. And then Samuel and the others all stood back and cheered while two of their friends began, fighting each other in the middle of the apartment. It was like this totally crazy, booze-fueled just madness happening inside of this place. And Samuel was having the time of his life, not thinking remotely about how absolutely miserable it was going to be waking up in now just a few hours when his alarm went off at 5 a.m. He was just doing his best not to think about it. Enjoy the party, that's it. And so for a while, the madness continued until eventually people did get really tired and began leaving, and before long, it was just Samuel standing in his now totally destroyed apartment from this party. And so at this point, Samuel, he looked at his clock and he saw he had, barely 2 hours before he would have to get up for work. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so awful. I'm going to feel so miserable. But it was totally worth it. What a great party. And so very drunkenly, Samuel kind of stumbled his way over to his bed. He just fell right down on top of it and he fell asleep. And sure enough, just about 2 hours later at 5 a.m. sharp, his alarm went off. Hours later, on Christmas afternoon, A local police officer walked up to Samuel Wardell's front door and knocked. The officer was there because Samuel's boss had called the station when Samuel had failed to show up for work that morning. And this was so out of character for Samuel that right away his boss contacted the police and said, please, someone needs to go check on him and make sure he's okay. And so now the officer waited at the door for Samuel. But when no one answered, he tried the door handle. And he found it was locked, but this was a very rickety, tiny home, and the officer could tell it would not take much to basically kick the door in. And so after calling out for Samuel a few more times and knocking, pretty loud and still not getting a response, the officer just stepped back and then kicked the door and blasted it open. And so the officer stepped inside the home and immediately saw Samuel. And when he did, he understood why he had missed work. It would turn out when Samuel went to bed after his big party, he forgot to move his bed back into the position that it normally was in. He had moved the furniture around for that boxing match and just didn't put it back. And so instead, he wound up going to sleep with his bed all the way across the room, under the shelf where he kept his alarm clock. And this was like the worst place for Samuel to fall asleep. Because, he had set his alarm to go off at 5 a.m. the following morning, just like he did every day. But his alarm clock was not a normal alarm clock. Samuel had intentionally altered his alarm clock to be way louder than a standard alarm clock. But the way he had done that was fairly unique. He had run a wire between a normal alarm clock and this shelf that had hinges. Basically, the shelf could, be situated like this, or it could fold down, basically making it flush to the wall. So it could hold stuff or be flush to the wall. And so when his normal wind-up alarm clock would go off in the morning and begin to ring, it would begin to vibrate and would sort of move across the shelf. And connected to it was this wire that ran to the hinges. And at a certain point, when this alarm sort of got far enough, it would pull enough to disable the hinges, and the shelf that was situated like this would suddenly fall. And in order to make this alarm really, really loud, Samuel had put a 10-pound rock on that shelf. So the instant the hinges dropped, that 10-pound rock came crashing down and smashed into the floor, causing a huge noise that consistently woke Samuel up. But on the morning after his big party, because Samuel was sleeping now directly under the shelf because he didn't move his bed back, that 10-pound rock didn't hit the ground. It fell and smashed directly into Samuel's head and broke his skull. After being discovered by that police officer, Samuel was rushed to a local hospital, but later died from his injuries. On the afternoon of Friday, February 7th, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lejeune cleared the table after lunch at her house in Cologne, France. Her husband, Claude, and two of her adult sons, Franck and Pascal, were at the table. And while Monique cleaned up, the men talked over what they needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were heading to a family gathering near Paris, about 3.5 hours away, to celebrate Claude's sister-in-law's retirement. Monique was not going to go, and she had told her family it was because somebody had to stay home with their 4 dogs. And that was true, but there also was another real reason why Monique did not want to be there. And it was because she just didn't get along very well with Claude's family. So Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier, but at the time they both already had multiple kids from previous marriages. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. And for a while, the two halves of the blended family had gotten along quite well. But over time, there were some personality clashes between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. When Monique and Claude got married, all 5 girls were at least teenagers, if not in their 20s. And so while they sort of accepted Monique as being part of their lives, they just couldn't view her as an actual motherly figure. They were already close with their actual mother, Claude's ex-wife Beatrice. And so that was their mother, and Monique was like the add-on. Then, in 1993, one of Claude's grandsons, so one of his daughter's children, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him, and that had completely ripped the family apart. Now, this was never reported to the police, so there was no actual investigation into whether this really happened or not, but Claude's 5 daughters and Claude's ex-wife Beatrice had fully believed the grandson.
and Monique had defended her son, Jean-Luc, and Claude was kind of stuck in the middle of it. And it had gotten so ugly that the two sides of the family had just stopped talking to each other for a whole year. And so now the whole family was basically back on speaking terms as they were getting ready for this retirement party, but it was still extremely uncomfortable and tense. And so that is why Monique was not going to go, and also why her son, Jean-Luc, was not going to go as well. Finally, around 3 p.m., as Claude and the two sons wheeled their suitcases out to the car, Monique went to the front door and she said goodbye to them and then watched as they hopped in the car and drove off. A few hours later, around 6:30 p.m., Monique heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it, it was her son Jean-Luc, and he was standing there holding up his bicycle. He told his mom he was just stopping by on his way home from work. And she said, "Great, come on in." And so Jean-Luc left his bike outside and he walked in, and as he was taking off his coat, he mentioned to his mother that her neighbor across the street, whose name was Henri, had clearly been watching Jean-Luc when he rolled up, like he was basically spying on him. And Monique actually kind of was spooked by that, because Henri was a bit of a loose cannon. For example, anytime anybody parked their car in front of Henri's house, he would shamelessly vandalize their vehicle by slashing their tires or pouring oil all over their car. I mean, the guy just didn't care. In fact, over the years, there had been several heated arguments between Monique and her sons and Henri about parking. And in fact, one of those arguments had even escalated into a physical fight. But since Jean-Luc had shown up tonight without a car, he rode his bike here, Monique just hoped that, whatever issues Henri had, that it wouldn't go anywhere, because there's no car in front of his property, like, we didn't do anything, leave us alone. Monique led her son into the kitchen, where she poured 2 glasses of sparkling wine, and then the two just sat there and chatted for about half an hour, and then Monique gave her son a haircut, and then around 7:05, Jean-Luc said goodbye to his mom. He went outside, hopped on his bike, which had not had its tires slashed by Henri, and he left to go to his apartment with his wife to have dinner. After Jean-Luc was gone, Monique just sort of went about her evening. She corralled the dogs behind a baby gate at the base of the stairs and then fed them, and then she went into the kitchen and began cooking dinner for herself. But then, a little while later, at around 7:30 p.m., Monique heard another knock on the door. And she knew it very likely was not her son, and so as she walked down the hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri. The following morning, the woman who lived next door to Monique woke up feeling pretty tired. She hadn't slept well because someone's dogs in the neighborhood had been barking all night. She got out of bed and walked over to the window and opened up the blinds, and as her eyes adjusted to the light that was flooding in, she looked down from her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house that was next door, Monique's house. And the neighbor saw there was something dark in the middle of the walkway that led to the front door of Monique's house. And so the neighbor, she put her face right up to the window and she squinted to get a better look. And she realized what she was seeing was a body lying face down on the pavement. And so in a panic, this woman ran out of her room, grabbed the phone, and called the police. A couple hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Anne Preem pulled up in front of a white 2-story house with crime scene tape and a medical examiner's van right out front. As Preem got out of her car, a police officer walked over to her and led her to where the body of a woman was lying out in the front yard. The officer told Preem that the victim, Monique Lejeune, had been discovered exactly like this by her neighbors earlier that morning. And based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had likely died between 8 p.m. and midnight the night before. Preem bent down to get a better look at the body, but even before getting up close, she knew this woman had sustained just gruesome injuries. There was blood all over Monique's face and her clothes, and her torso appeared completely ripped apart by what appeared to be stab wounds. Preem guessed, just from looking at the scene, that this woman must have been murdered and likely was stabbed, just at first glance, at least a dozen times. Preem also noticed pretty obvious defense wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms, which certainly suggested again that she was murdered and that Monique had put up a pretty good fight against her killer. And so after a few more moments of just kind of looking over the body, Preem stood back up and asked the officer if the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And the officer said no. Aside from the fact that Monique's dogs, she had 4 dogs, had been barking nonstop, really the whole night, starting at around 8 p.m. Preem nodded and thanked the officer, and then she made her way over to the front door of the house to look to see if there was any signs of forced entry, as the door was closed. When she got there, she didn't see any signs, but she did see a bloody handprint on the outside wall near the door. And then, when Preem turned the handle of the door and opened it up, she saw this hallway inside that was absolutely covered in blood. And so Preem very carefully stepped inside, trying to avoid stepping in the blood or tracking any prints anywhere. And she began walking down the hallway very carefully and looking in other rooms. And she saw that for the most part, the blood spatter was pretty well contained in the entryway, which told her that the attack on Monique likely began and ended in the entryway. And so her running theory was, okay, Monique must have had someone come to the door, they knocked or whatever, and then Monique opened the door and was attacked immediately. But then, as Preem stepped back outside, she looked down at the front walkway and noticed something kind of unusual. Despite all the blood right inside the front door, there was no blood at all on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. And just from the amount of blood that the victim had clearly lost inside the house, Preem doubted that she would have been capable of running out into the yard after the attack. So she had to wonder if maybe the body had been moved post-mortem. And Monique was a large woman, so if her killer had been able to overpower her, one, and then also move her body such a far distance after she was dead, Preem assumed that whoever her killer was likely pretty strong. In fact, Preem just kind of assumed that the killer had to be a big, strong man. However, what Preem didn't understand was why would the killer want to drag a corpse out into the yard where the neighbors could see them? Unless, for some reason, they wanted Monique to be found as soon as possible. And since at least at this point, it appeared like Monique likely had gone to the front door and opened the door for her killer, Preem thought that the killer must be someone that she knew. Around noon on that same day, so February 8th, 2003, Police Captain Anne Preem was about to go next door and speak to one of Monique's neighbors herself when suddenly a car pulled up at the curb and 3 men climbed out looking completely shocked and very concerned. By this point, Preem had learned from the neighbors that Monique had a husband and also adult sons, and so Preem assumed that these men must be them. So right away, Preem hurried down the walkway to cut the men off, to keep them from entering the crime scene. And the 3 men, they just began crowding around her, asking her, what's going on? Where's Monique? What's happened? And she told them that, unfortunately, Monique had been stabbed to death. And at first, all 3 of them just went completely silent. And then one of the sons, just began to cry. Preem then told them that they couldn't go into the house because it was still an active crime scene. So instead, she led them over to the curb, and they all sat down. Preem could tell the men were in shock, because as much as one man was crying, it just seemed like they couldn't even process what they were told. But it was important to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So Preem pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, said that they had all left the house around 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home alone. They said they had gone to a family gathering near Paris that evening and stayed overnight, and they'd only now just gotten back into town, and they'd seen this whole scene out front, the police tape, and police, they had no idea what was going on. Eventually, Preem asked Claude to tell him all the names of all the people in their family, all their adult children, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everybody. But as Claude was giving this information, he told her that he just couldn't imagine anybody in the family being involved in this. Preem nodded, but she knew that it was entirely possible that family was involved. I mean, unfortunately, this stuff does happen. But she didn't give that off. Instead, she just said, well, can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Monique? And Claude thought about it and just said no. She lived a pretty normal and uneventful life. But then one of the sons piped up and mentioned that actually there might be someone. He said her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed across the street at the house. A minute later, Preem was knocking on the front door of Henri's house, and after a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered the door. and he was very curious about what was going on across the street. And eventually, Prem told him that, well, your neighbor Monique has been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. So immediately, alarm bells are going off in Prem's head. She's thinking this guy is very suspicious. And she asked him, like, can I come in and look around then? And Henri didn't even seem surprised by this request. It was like he already knew he was going to be looked at as a suspect and said, sure, come on in. So he stepped aside and Prem came in and began searching every room in the house, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or really anything else suspicious or unusual. So eventually, Prem made her way back into the living room where Henri was waiting, and she asked him, where were you the previous evening? And he told her very casually that, well, he and his wife were home. They were here. Prem thought this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife and confirm it later. Next, Prem asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said no, except that maybe around 7 p.m., he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. And at this, Prem perked up because the family had told her that Monique had a third adult son named Jean-Luc, who had not gone to that party in Paris. And if Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to see Monique alive. And maybe he was even the killer. The next morning, Prem led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchy part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment, and a moment later, a young man answered. After confirming that he was Jean-Luc, 2 officers led him away to be questioned back at the station. Meanwhile, Prem went in with the forensics team to search his apartment. And pretty quickly, as Prem was walking around the living room, one of the other officers called her over to look at something. And so she walked over to him, and she saw he had his flashlight out and he was pointing it at something on the wall. And when she got close enough, she could see that what he was highlighting were what appeared to be tiny drops of blood. And so Prem pulled out her flashlight, and she too began scouring the walls and the floor near the stairs, looking for any more blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob to a closet. And so she opened the closet up, and inside was a bike. And she shined her flashlight on the bike, on the wheels and the frame, and she saw all these reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of it, as if whoever had ridden this bike last had basically drove through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Prem walked into an interrogation room at the police station where Jean-Luc was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and he had this very scared and confused expression on his face. Prem sat down across from him and right away asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc said he had just stopped by after work, as he often did, and he only stayed for maybe half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Prem asked him if he had gone straight home afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, Christophe Gressier, lived in the same apartment building as they did on the floor right below them. So before going up to his own unit, he said he just stopped by to chat with Christophe for a few minutes, and then after that, he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. However, to Prem, she felt like there had to be more to this story, because they had found what appeared to be droplets of blood sort of scattered throughout Jean-Luc's apartment, and then, there was blood, or at least what appeared to be blood, on the underside of his bike. And so she figured, maybe if she pushed hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So she told him point blank they had found blood in his living room, and they were now sending it to the lab for analysis. And when Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red, and he began stammering that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting a few days earlier. Prem nodded, but then told him, they'd also found blood sort of all over his bike. And Jean-Luc, he sort of hesitated and stuttered and stammered, but really couldn't come up with any way to explain that. At this point, Prem felt like she had Jean-Luc right where she wanted him. So she just told him to be quiet for a second and just roll up your sleeves so she could look at his arms. Prem knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she likely had fought back really hard, and she must have left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. However, when Jean-Luc finally, rolled up his sleeves, Prem didn't see a single scratch or bruise on his hands or arms. A few minutes later, Prem left the interrogation room and walked to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds, Jean-Luc was definitely still acting suspicious, and she was not ready to let him go. But she also didn't want to get tunnel vision and completely ignore any other suspects, in case the blood inside of Jean-Luc's apartment did turn out to just be a big coincidence. So she sat down at her desk, and she opened up a file, and she began flipping through the notes of interviews that her team had already done with the rest of Monique's family and her neighbors. Monique's sons had mentioned in their interviews that there was definitely some tension between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had spoken to all the stepdaughters as well as their husbands, and even though some of the women had admitted they still had an issue with Monique, they all had alibis, both the women and their husbands, for the night that Monique was killed. Also, several other family members had mentioned that Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, definitely did not get along with Monique. But officers had tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a very strong suspect. Beatrice had said, for the most part, she and Monique, even if they didn't get along, they just stayed out of each other's way, and that they hadn't seen each other in over a month. And also, Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was barely 4 foot 9 inches tall and 58 years old and just seemed really weak. So it just seemed almost impossible that she could have overpowered the much larger Monique and inflicted the injuries that were inflicted on her and then dragged her out to the front yard. It just seemed sort of impossible. And so, even though she wasn't totally ruled out, for the most part she was. Just then, there was a knock on Preem's door. And when she looked up, she saw there was another officer standing there. And he told her there were 2 people here who wanted to speak to her. Preem nodded, and then a moment later, a very nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman came into the office. They sat down across the desk from Preem, and the man said they had information that could help with the Monique Lejeune investigation. Preem sat up and grabbed a notepad and said, "Okay, tell me what you got." And she began writing as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gressier. And Preem immediately recognized that that was the name of Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the one Jean-Luc said he had visited on the night Monique was killed. That was the person he saw apparently right after he left Monique's house. The man sitting across from Preem said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a sort of muffled conversation between 2 women. And at first, this man thought what he was hearing was just an accidental call, maybe by Christophe's kid who was just pressing buttons at random. However, the man said when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman he was with, they both started listening really closely, and they were able to make out a snippet of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi and saying something about a man named Jean-Luc. First, the women had said something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then the women had mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Preem couldn't believe what she was hearing. Any doubts that she had had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much disappeared. And so she took down the couple's names and contact info, showed them out of her office, and then once they were gone, she grabbed her keys and she headed out to go to Christophe's apartment. Now, by this point, Christophe had already been taken into custody and questioned, and he had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the phone call that was apparently made from his number. But Preem hoped that maybe a search of his apartment would tell a different story. She walked through each room of the apartment until she found the washing machine. And there, she put on a pair of latex gloves, and she reached inside the washing machine and she pulled out a pair of pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. And she held these pants up and kind of put them in the light, and she could see clearly there was a brownish stain on them. She also noticed that these pants looked like they'd be way too small for Christophe, who was a pretty tall and burly guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a guy like Jean-Luc, who was much smaller. Later that same day, so this is on February 10th, 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain Preem was in her office when her phone rang. She answered it, and it was a technician from the crime lab telling her they actually already had the results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. And so Preem, she's geared up, ready to hear some potentially, case-breaking news. But the tech told her that the stains that were on the bike, it was blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood that were in Jean-Luc's apartment, like on the walls and near the door handle of the closet, it was blood, but not a match for Monique's. And then also those pants that had been found, that stain on the pants, that wasn't blood at all. That stain was just grease. Prem was very frustrated because in her mind, she had sort of zeroed in on Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now they really had no physical evidence against him. And as for that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, they really had no way of knowing who those two women in the background were, or even if the coworker and his wife had actually overheard the conversation correctly, about the alibi and about Jean-Luc being depressed. Who knows if they actually heard that. So Prem thanked the lab technician for calling with the update, despite how disappointing it was. And she was about to hang up when he told her to wait, because he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had actually found DNA under Monique's fingernails, and it was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it, but once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects, and maybe it would be a match. This definitely gave Prem some hope. And after she hung up, she began making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from so they could test against it. She definitely knew she would need one from Jean-Luc and Christophe, and then also that neighbor Henri seemed like a strong suspect too. Prem had actually spoken to Henri's wife and confirmed that, at least according to her, they were together that whole night Monique was killed. But she also knew that spouses were very likely to lie for each other, so it was a flimsy alibi. So at this point, Prem felt like she definitely had 3 good potential suspects to get DNA from. But realistically, that was where her list ended. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out by this point, and none of the other neighbors really seemed like suspects. And by all accounts, Monique lived a pretty quiet suburban life and just didn't really get into trouble with anyone, so there really was no one else. And so to Prem, it just felt like something was missing here. Like, in the time I have between now and when the analysis is done on that DNA underneath Monique's fingernails, I need to see if there's something I've missed. And so over the next few weeks, that's what Prem did. She pored over all the evidence they'd collected, and she re-interviewed all the family members and spoke to all the neighbors. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up that brought any other suspects into view. However, at the same time, this is early March by this point, maybe 3-4 weeks after the tech had said they would test this DNA, Prem got another call from the crime lab, and the technician said that the DNA analysis had come back. And even before they tested it against any specific suspects, the results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Prem heard what the tech had to say about the analysis so far, she realized that this was, in fact, the missing piece of information that she needed. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and also an eventual confession by the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Lejeune on the night of February 7th, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting the killer inside, Monique just kind of crossed her arms and stared. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into an argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then at some point, Monique slammed the door in the killer's face. But before she did, she said one last thing that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. And so without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this totally inflammatory line, they stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby, and they grabbed the knife they kept under their seat for self-defense. And they carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. And as soon as the door opened, the killer pushed their way inside, and with a surge of rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was very strong and big, and she knocked the killer to the ground and actually pinned them there. But the killer managed to wrestle their arm free that was holding the knife. But Monique, she kept fighting back. I mean, this was an epic struggle. And also, the whole time this is happening, Monique's 4 dogs have basically come over to the gate, which butted up against the entryway, and they're watching this happen, and they're barking like mad, and Monique is screaming out in rage and panic and pain, until finally they were able to break away from Monique, who kind of had them pinned, despite, getting stabbed repeatedly. And then once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got in their vehicle, began pulling away, and as they did that, they saw Monique stumble out the front door. She took a few steps down the walkway and collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was really dead. Instead, they sped away. And then they stopped at a supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, in a trash can. And then the killer went home, and they burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove. They thought that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this crime, especially considering the fact that they knew they were like the last person anybody would suspect of such a horrible, violent murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot, 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally, bury the hatchet after years of feuding between the two sides of Claude's family. But she said the bad blood ran way too deep, and when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the last inflammatory line as she shut the door, Beatrice said she snapped. Beatrice had actually been ruled out as a suspect primarily because she was really, really small, like too small to have overpowered Monique and then to have potentially moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out Monique's body was not moved at all. She stumbled out herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after getting attacked that she had managed to, chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And keep in mind, she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so right away, the DNA analysis showed that their killer was a woman. And further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. Investigators never figured out who made that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, but their best guess was that the women that were heard on the phone call were Christophe's mother and sister. And it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on March 29, 2003, and she confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted the confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in jail.
On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1962, a middle-aged woman named Angelina Narcisse walked into a hospital room inside the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer, which is a medical center in central Haiti. Inside, Angelina saw one of her brothers, 40-year-old Clervius, propped up in the hospital bed. He had an IV sticking out of one arm, and he had an oxygen mask strapped over his face. His eyes were closed, and when Angelina touched his hand and said hello, he didn't react. So Angelina had just been briefed by Clervius' doctors about what was going on here. She knew that 2 days earlier, her brother had come to the hospital coughing up blood and also running a dangerously high fever. Doctors had managed to get his fever down, but they determined that his blood pressure was really high and he also had fluid accumulating in his lungs. But they didn't know why any of that was happening or how to control it or stop it. So now, less than 48 hours after Clervius' symptoms began, he was barely conscious. And so for Angelina, it was obviously, very scary to see her brother so sick like this, but it was also confusing because she knew that one of her other brothers had seen Clervius just a few hours before he had shown up at the hospital with these horrible symptoms. And Clervius, at the time, had seemed completely fine. So really, this illness seemed to have come out of nowhere. But as Angelina looked around the hospital room, she also found herself feeling pretty annoyed because she had 4 other siblings, 2 more brothers and 2 sisters, and none of them were here. Now, Angelina knew she shouldn't be surprised. Ever since their parents had died, there had been basically nonstop drama between all the siblings, and most of the drama centered around Clervius himself. So when their parents had passed away, Clervius was the one who had ultimately inherited their money and land. And so these days, he was sort of living like a king. He lived in one of the nicest places in their village and was constantly flaunting his wealth. Meanwhile, Angelina and her other siblings really struggled financially. And anytime they asked Clervius for help, he refused, which had caused a huge rift in the family. So, Angelina was now the only one who'd even shown up to visit him in the hospital, despite his condition being so dire. But, nonetheless, she sat down on a plastic chair inside the room, and for a few minutes, she just watched Clervius breathing. And for a while, his breathing seemed normal. It was rhythmic, slow, but normal. But then suddenly, Clervius's breath seemed to almost catch in his chest. And then he began making a sort of wheezing, gurgling sound, but he's like half conscious. So it was like his body was reacting to not being able to breathe. Angelina instinctively just stood up and grabbed her brother's hand and began to squeeze it. And as she did, she saw her brother's eyelids flutter open for a second, but then his eyelids closed. And she watched as underneath his eyelids, she could see his eyes kind of darting around all over the place. And then at the same time, this sort of wheezing sound that was coming out of her brother turned into a choking noise. And so Angelina at this point let go of her brother's hand, she ran into the hallway and she found a doctor. But unfortunately, by the time she explained what was going on and she and this doctor returned to the hospital room, they found Clervius no longer making any noise. He was totally still. And so the doctor rushed over to him and he checked for a pulse, but he couldn't find one. And he turned to Angelina and he said, "I'm sorry, but your brother is dead." The following morning, May 3rd, Angelina arrived at the small cemetery near their village for her brother's funeral. And she was glad to see that at least this time her 4 remaining siblings had decided to show up. But at the same time, Angelina, she was in shock. She couldn't believe what had happened. The doctors had told her that ultimately Clervius had died from something called malignant hypertension, which is basically blood pressure that's so high it causes organ damage. And also it causes pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs that can ultimately make it impossible to breathe, which very likely was what that sound was her brother was making before he died, that choking sound. But the doctors told Angelina that despite knowing sort of what actually happened to Clervius, they didn't know why it happened. It was totally unclear how he got these symptoms in the first place. And unfortunately for Angelina and their family, it seemed pretty unlikely that they would ever figure it out. It would just be this mystery. Now, as Angelina walked up to Clervius's gravesite, she looked down and she saw her brother lying dead inside of his open casket. She reached out and touched his hand one last time, and it was so cold that Angelina pulled it away right away, and then she began to cry. The ceremony was kind of a blur for Angelina. The whole thing just felt surreal. But eventually it wrapped up, and Angelina and her other siblings were walking up to the casket to say their final goodbyes to their brother. And then after they did, they stepped back and they watched as cemetery employees closed Clervius's casket and lowered it into the ground. However, after Angelina and her family had all returned to their homes and were, beginning to grieve the loss of their brother, something else began to happen at that cemetery. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, street lights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it. Don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly, and switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That same night, a little after midnight, 2 men sort of conspicuously entered the small cemetery carrying shovels. As they walked, they kind of kept looking around to make sure nobody was watching them, and they went up to Clervius's very fresh grave. And with their shovels, they dug and dug until finally they revealed his casket, and they pulled his casket out of the ground. They pried the nails off the top, they flipped it open, and there was Clervius's body. And they pulled his body out, and they laid it on the ground next to the hole in the ground. Then, as fast as they could, they closed the casket back up, now with Clervius's body again outside of it on the ground nearby, and they reburied the casket. They put all the dirt back, all the grass back, made it look like nobody had touched it. And then after that was done, they walked over to Clervius's body, and they tied his wrists and ankles together with rope. Then they wrapped Clervius's body in a large black cloth, and then together they hoisted his body up and placed him on their respective shoulders, and together they carried him out of the cemetery and off into the wilderness on the outskirts of the village. And then when the sun began to rise, they stopped and found a good spot to hide along with Clervius's body in the trees. And then when the sun went back down again, the two men were up and on the move again with the body. These men did this for days until finally they reached a massive fenced-in plot of land in northern Haiti. When they got there, it was just starting to get light outside. And so with the light, they could see dozens and dozens of these people moving through this vast field in front of them. And all these people were moving in a sort of jerky, unnatural way. And all of them were holding machetes. But these two men who had lugged Clervius's body here were not afraid. They unlocked the fence and carried Clervius's body right up a pathway through the middle of this field, past all these people. But as they passed by these machete-wielding people, they didn't even seem to notice the men or the body. It was like this was totally normal. Eventually, the men reached the middle of this field where there was this building, and the men went inside. And the interior of this building was basically one large room with a table in the center and a bunch of shelves that lined the walls. And the shelves were all stacked with glass containers that had things in them like dried plants and some taxidermied smaller animals, and also what appeared to be some human bones. And standing in the middle of this room was these two men's boss. He was a very old man, and he had this very expectant look on his face. Without saying a word, the two men placed Clervius's body on the table in the center of this room, and they unwrapped the black cloth around him. Their boss looked very carefully at Clervius's face, and then he smiled, and he handed each of the men a stack of money. 18 years later, in February of 1980, Clervius's sister, Angelina, walked through an outdoor market in her small village in central Haiti. Now, by this point, it had been almost 2 decades since Clervius had died, and Angelina didn't really think about him that much anymore. But on this particular day, as she was shopping, an old man approached her, and he was very thin, his face was very sunken, and he had this long, deep scar on his cheek that went from the side of his mouth to his ear, and his eyes were bloodshot, and they were kind of wide, like he was sort of wild, and in this gravelly voice, he told her that his name was Clervius, and that he was her brother. But when Angelina saw this guy and heard this, she did not think this was her brother. She thought, this man is obviously out of his mind, or he's lying, or both. But this is clearly not my brother Clervius. He's dead. And on top of that, like in addition to all the discrepancies that she's immediately clocking, this man did not remotely look like her brother did. He looked completely different. In particular, there was this big scar on his face that she certainly didn't remember on Clervius's face. So Angelina told this man that, no, you are not my brother and you need to leave me alone. But the man, when he heard this, he sort of freaked out and he grabbed Angelina's shoulders and started violently shaking her, insisting that no, he really was Clervius. Angelina screamed, and the next thing she knew, she was surrounded by a crowd of very confused but worried onlookers. And then a police officer walked over and grabbed the man and dragged him away. Later that same day, a police officer sat in an interview room at the police station across from this older man who kept insisting he was Clervius. And the story that this man told the officer about how he could be a man who had died 18 years earlier really was absolutely insane. Because this man claimed that 18 years earlier, when he died, he remembered that moment because he heard the doctor literally pronounce him dead, and he heard his siblings start to cry. And then he remembered the cold when the hospital staff moved him to the refrigerated morgue. And then he remembered the sound of them nailing his coffin shut, and he remembered what it felt like when one of those nails punctured through and cut his cheek. That's how he got that big scar on his face. It was a nail in his coffin going through his face. Basically, he wasn't dead. He was totally mentally conscious of everything happening to him. He just physically couldn't move or react in any way, and he didn't know why. But everybody thought he was dead, and he wasn't. And then he said later that same night, as he's literally in a coffin underground, basically waiting to suffocate to death, he became aware of two men suddenly unearthing him and removing him from his coffin, and then they tied him up, wrapped him in cloth, and then carried him into the wilderness for days. And then finally they entered this building in the middle of this field, and they set him down on this table, and then he heard this third man thank the man that had carried him, and then this third man poured something into Clervius's mouth, and then this guy just started chanting over and over again. And then a few minutes later, he found his body sort of was beginning to work again. He could open his eyes, he could sort of move his limbs, but things just felt different. Like suddenly his vision was very strange and hazy, and his body movements were jerky and uncoordinated. It almost felt like his mind was moving slower than it really was supposed to, like it was just dumbed down or something. And it was at that point that Clervius said he realized what was actually going on here. Clervius said this old man that had poured whatever in his mouth and was now chanting, he was a Bokor, which is a voodoo priest in Haiti. And Clervius said the Bokor had used a potion to turn Clervius into a zombie. Clervius told the police officer that he'd been absolutely terrified and he wanted to fight back, but his body felt like jello and he could barely form a coherent thought, so there was no way he could actually do anything. He said the Bokor, shortly after this, untied him, made him stand up, and then marched him outside of this building. And he said everything looked so blurry outside, but he could tell, despite his vision, that he was in the middle of a huge sugarcane field. And he saw at least a dozen other people moving in the same sort of awkward, jerky way that he knew he was, harvesting the sugarcane with machetes. The Bokor at this point handed Clervius a machete and told him to get out there and join them and get to work. Now, something deep in Clervius's mind told him to use the machete to attack the Bokor so he could escape, but he said he didn't. Instead, he just walked out into the field and did start working. And he kept working day in and day out in this bizarre zombie-like state for 2 full years. Then one day, another one of these zombies finally did attack and kill the Bokor. And suddenly all the zombies were free. But the man saying he was Clervius did not go straight home. He couldn't, because he knew this Bokor had not randomly targeted him. He had been hired, the Bokor had been hired to turn Clervius into a zombie. And in the mind of this man who claimed to be Clervius, there was only one person who would have hired this Bokor to do that. And that person was still alive back home in his village. And so if he returned, they would very likely just kill him. So this man told the police officer that he had gone on to spend 16 years just wandering around northern Haiti, working random odd jobs, just kind of barely surviving. But he said he did keep up with news from his village. And when he saw that the person who he believed had ultimately hired the Bokor to do this to him, when he saw that person had died, he said he felt safe enough to finally go back home. Now, after hearing the story, the police officer did not immediately think, boy, this is legitimate, this must have happened. Instead, he thought this sounded completely insane. But just in case, he went to Clervius's siblings and he asked them to give him a list of questions that only the real Clervius could answer, like super specific information from their childhood and things like that. And when the officer came back with this list and began asking this man the questions, the man claiming to be Clervius answered all of them correctly. This really was Clervius. The news of Clervius's return from the dead quickly spread all across the globe. But for the most part, when people outside of Haiti read or heard about it, they assumed the story was just folklore or some kind of hoax. But in 1982, so 20 years after Clervius supposedly died, and 2 years after he supposedly came back to life, a Harvard University researcher named Wade Davis actually traveled to Haiti to investigate the story. And what he found was that Clervius was definitely telling the truth. Here's what many scientists and Clervius's family believe really happened to him on the morning of April 30th, 1962, when he first got really sick. So that morning, he did wake up feeling perfectly fine. He was completely healthy, just like his sister Angelina had thought. But according to Clervius himself, that same afternoon, one of his brothers came over and said he just wanted to put the whole family drama, about the inheritance behind them. And then he gave Clervius a hug. But what Clervius did not know at the time was that during this hug, his brother intentionally rubbed a fine powder onto his skin. Now, this powder did make Clervius incredibly sick, but it was not designed to kill him. Instead, it completely paralyzed him. He couldn't move his arms, his legs, his eyes, nothing, and it lowered his heart rate so low that doctors thought Clervius was dead, which is exactly what Clervius's brother and the Beaucourt he conspired with had planned for. They knew he would be determined to be dead, he would be buried really quickly, and then right after he was buried, the Beaucourts sent those two men to dig Clervius up while he was still paralyzed. They carried him off to that sugarcane plantation where he became a slave. Basically, he was given drugs every day and forced to work nonstop. And for the brother, Clervius's brother, the reason he did this is to punish Clervius for being so selfish with the money he inherited from their parents. This was the plan, to turn him into that zombie slave. It would turn out the active ingredient in the paralyzing powder that the brother rubbed on Clervius was tetrodotoxin, which is a poison found in pufferfish. And then the active ingredient in the liquid that the Beaucourt gave Clervius when he arrived and then continued to give him on a near daily basis to keep him in line was called the zombie's cucumber, which is a hallucinogenic plant that's native to Haiti. After returning to his village and telling his story to the world, Clervius actually would go on to live a relatively normal life. He would live with his siblings until he died in 1994 at the age of 72. Even though, he was able to clearly articulate who did this to him, his brother and the Beaucourt, both of them were dead by the time he returned and told his story, so nobody was ever held to account for any of this.